Well, this is lovely, isn't it? What an amazing venue. Didn't even know this was here. And then I walked past it on my way to lunch, thinking it was so beautiful, and now I'm sitting inside it. So thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to come and speak. So, as mentioned, I've just last year published a book called Bodies Under Siege, which looks at the far-right attack on reproductive rights, focusing primarily in the global north, so Europe and the US. And I wanted to talk today a little bit about some of the subjects in the book, but also have a little chat about why this is relevant for the UK election and for the future of UK politics. Which is something that came as quite a surprise to me, because when I was writing the book, I was a little bit smug and thinking, oh, these things don't happen here. And then the last year has quite categorically proven me wrong. So what my book does is looks at a pipeline of how fascist ideology about women's bodies has kind of been codified through a series of conspiracy theories that are sort of shared on the far right and networked across the far right. But that concerningly, these ideas and these conspiracy theories have become sort of laundered by respectable organizations who work with the UN, who have influence at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, who lobby the European Union and lobby the UK government, in order to make these anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ+, and anti-gender policies, ideas into policy in mainstream politics. So my book kind of starts with this idea that there's a conspiracy theory on the far right, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, called the Great Replacement. And this conspiracy theory believes that white people in the global north are being replaced by people from the global south, and that this replacement is being aided by feminism, which is reducing the white birth rate via contraception and abortion. Now, I don't need to tell you that this conspiracy theory is complete nonsense. There is absolutely no way that there is a great replacement, or the other word they use is white genocide. It's a completely racist, anti-migrant, anti-women, homophobic, nasty conspiracy theory. But it's kind of been increasingly shared on the far right and sort of communicated via far-right networks on Telegram, on kind of these nasty forums that you never want to look at, and supported by ultra-misogynistic activists, such as incels, who believe that women shouldn't have any human rights, and the Red Pill group, which believes that women are just objects, really, for men's use. And as I always thought when I was researching the book, I was like, well, this is fine, you know, this is really ugly stuff, and it's really violent and really unpleasant. But if it was just happening on dark corners of the internet, we could all go to sleep at night and just think these are horrible people saying horrible things in their horrible spaces to each other. But what I was increasingly noticing is that these anti-abortion, anti-migrant, racist and homophobic narratives were becoming more and more popular with mainstream politicians. And where this has been really prominent in Europe is particularly in Hungary, where the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has sort of taken Great Replacement conspiracy theory and put it into his political mandate and into policy making. So Orbán very famously in 2019 addressed a conference in Budapest where he talked about replacement and actually used the word replacement when trying to explain his family protection policy, which incentivizes ethnic Hungarian women who are married to Hungarian men to have more babies, while at the same time pushing against migration into the EU and particularly pushing against refugee policies in the EU. And for me, this was the moment that Great Replacement conspiracy theory went mainstream, because here was this man, you know, an EU leader, a prime minister in Europe, talking about the word replacement when justifying racist and misogynistic policies. We also had in Iowa a congressman called Steve King, who talked about how American culture was being replaced by migration, and that replacement was being aided by abortion. And this is someone who was in Congress in the run-up to the overruling of Roe v. Wade, which banned abortion, which led to individual states to have the power to ban abortion. And so what was once this kind of ugly, grim, racist narrative on far-right Telegram channels was suddenly being voiced by people who had the power to make decisions over women's lives. So that was kind of where I started in my book. And what I found out was just a lot of horrible things. So I spent far too much time on incel forums where I read lots of things about how men didn't want women to have rights at all. I spent far too much time on the far-right Telegram, and I even went undercover in the anti-abortion movement, where I learned that abortion was actually a satanic ritual sacrifice, and that the reason we had so many abortions in the West is because Westminster is in the grip of Satanism. Now, I think Westminster's in the grip of a lot of things, but Satanism isn't one of them. And what was really interesting to me, as I say, is that all of this stuff, which seemed so out there, which seemed so completely wild, was suddenly becoming more and more important on the political stage. So in 2019, when I went undercover in the anti-abortion movement and they started talking about Satanism, I was like, what the heck? What's this? This doesn't make any sense. Why are you talking about Satan? This is like an anti-abortion protest. You all like want to go and like harass Della Creasy in Walthamstow. But actually, it suddenly became clear to me that what they were doing was talking the QAnon conspiracy theory. Now, QAnon is one of the wildest conspiracy theories I've ever had the displeasure to read about, and I'm sure many of you will have heard about it on the news or read about it online. But QAnon believes that there is a plot of liberal elites who are trafficking children through underground tunnels in America, and the elites include Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks, the nicest man in America. Don't be fooled. And that they are having these satanic rituals in order to frighten children and sort of drain them of this hormone that's going to give the liberal elites eternal life. Now, at the last Congress election, there were at least 40 people standing for Congress who believed some or all of the QAnon conspiracy theory. So they actually believed that there were satanic rituals happening in tunnels underground in America, coordinated by Hillary Clinton and her best friend Tom Hanks. And these people, again, were standing for power in the US Congress election in order to influence policies that were helping to ban abortion, that were helping to deny women their fundamental human rights, and were helping to deny migrant people their fundamental human rights. So what, in a strange conference room in Holborn in 2019, seemed like a slightly weird aside on their discussions about abortion, was actually, again, part of this kind of far-right, fascistic thinking that was being transmitted online through Telegram, through online forums, and through these kind of murky community groups in order to spread a fear and a conspiracy that would ultimately be telegraphed all the way up to the decision-making places in the US Congress. So as I said, this would all be kind of a spectacle to be watching if it wasn't also happening in the UK. And I think I had, again, a little bit of smugness when I looked at some of the anti-abortion movements and the anti-gender movements across Europe and the US, and was like, well, in the UK, we're very pro-abortion. We've had some really, really big wins on abortion rights in the last few years. And it felt like things were all going in the right direction. So in 2019, they decided to decriminalize abortion in Northern Ireland. In 2020, they allowed for telemedicine of abortion as a response to the pandemic, which meant that women could now take abortion pills in their own home rather than having to do it in a medical clinic. And 2 years ago? A year and a half ago? Between a year and a half and 2 years ago, Parliament voted to introduce buffer zones around abortion clinics, which would mean that women who are attending an abortion appointment no longer have to face protesters outside the clinic. That law was passed, but it hasn't yet been implemented for a variety of reasons. And so I was quite confident. I was like, okay, we're moving in the right direction on abortion rights. There seems to be really positive change that is helping women access reproductive health care that is their human right and that they are entitled to. But then I started to notice that, as with many things happening in UK politics in the last few years, there's been a backlash against women's rights. And we can see this because we are increasingly noticing how US anti-abortion groups are increasing their influence and increasing their spending in the UK. So my favorite example of this is an organization called Alliance Defending Freedom, which is based in Arizona and has a London office called ADF International. And ADF International is also active across Europe and increasingly active in East Africa, or East and West Africa, actually. And in the past, since 2017, Alliance Defending Freedom, a US anti-abortion organization, has spent $2 million in the UK to try and push its agenda. And it's been, working with parliamentarians, so it hosted a UK MP at a conference in 2019. And it's also been quoted in government white papers. So ADF was quoted in a white paper on free speech on campus. And so what we're seeing is a kind of growing push from US groups into the UK to try and influence the debate around abortion, but also around LGBTQ+ rights and transgender rights in particular. And this really came to a head for me recently when it was the National Conservatism Conference, which took place in May. It took place in London the year before that, and then this year it was in Brussels. And we saw increasing numbers of UK MPs attending this conference where they were speaking alongside far-right figures and also people from organisations like ADF who push this anti-abortion agenda. And what was striking is that in 2019, a Conservative MP had gone to speak at this conference, and it was like an uproar. You know, there were demands that he apologised for attending this conference. It was seen as really, really off the Tory brand for an MP to go and speak alongside such controversial figures, figures who endorse conspiracy theories such as cultural Marxism. And yet, by 2024, it was normal for the former Home Secretary to be attending a conference again alongside far-right figures where they pushed this sort of anti-abortion, anti-migrant, and anti-LGBTQ+ agenda. For those of you who were here for Peter Gagan's talk, the Heritage Foundation is another US organisation that is strongly anti-abortion and strongly courting hard-right UK MPs. So numerous MPs that have spoken at Heritage Foundation, including Liz Truss, Liam Fox, Oliver Dowden, Priti Patel. They kind of are going to this think tank, which has put together an agenda called Project 2025 for a potential Trump win in the US that would seek to overturn all LGBTQ+ protections and further the abortion bans that have taken hold in the States. And this is not just a foreign influence situation. There's a kind of growing influence of the homegrown UK anti-abortion movement as well. So I mentioned how ADF has spent $2 million since 2017 in the UK, but we've also seen influential anti-abortion organisations like Right to Life increase their expenditure since 2017. They were spending around £200,000 a year. They're now spending close to £1 million a year on their activities. And the organisation where I went undercover with its line in Satanism, they're standing MP candidates against pro-abortion MPs across the country, so against Diana Johnson and against Stella Creasy, and have increased the number of staff that they have in their organisation, again to try and push this anti-abortion influence. But ultimately, as I mentioned, I do think that in the UK, the British Social Attitude Survey shows that there's a real support for abortion rights in the country. The vast majority of people in the UK are pro-choice and they want women to have access to reproductive health care. And this causes a problem for the anti-abortion movement because ultimately they don't really believe that they can win on abortion when it comes to pushing an anti-rights agenda. And so what we've seen is a pivot from this movement towards anti-LGBTQ+, and particularly anti-trans activism. And last year, I wrote a story about the protests outside drag queen storytelling events that have happened in London, particularly in Honour Oak. And it was just after Paul O'Grady died, and I was like, if you told me 5 years ago that Paul O'Grady would be dead and there'd be protests outside drag queen shows, I wouldn't have believed you. And yet, we are where we are. And so what we're really seeing at the moment is a real push by far-right activists, such as Stephen Yaxley-Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson, and people like Patriotic Alternative and Mark Collette, who runs that organisation, a real push against what they call gender ideology. And this covers everything from comprehensive sex education that is LGBTQ+ inclusive, to drag queen story hours, and just, sexual and reproductive health rights in general. This manifests in these protests that are happening outside the drag queen story hours, but they're also increasingly manifesting in Conservative Party policy. So just before Rishi Sunak called the election, they announced that they were going to redo the sex education curriculum to make it less inclusive and less focused on issues around consent and respect. And the suggestions they came up with were completely bizarre. They were like, we're going to talk about sharing intimate images when kids are in year 7, but we're not going to talk about porn until they're in year 9. And you're like, well, how does that work? Like, that doesn't make any sense. It's not joined up thinking. But what's really concerning to me is everywhere I've looked in how the far right and the anti-gender sort of politicians, anti-gender activists have worked across Europe is they find a context that they believe is going to work in each individual country. So in the US, it was very much focused on abortion. In Romania, when I first started investigating these issues, it was very much focused on equal marriage and LGBTQ+ rights. And what we're seeing in the UK is a real push from the far right and from hard right politicians against LGBTQ+ rights, because they see that as a way to get their agenda into the mainstream. And unfortunately, it's been very successful. So I have a lot of hope. I always want to end my talks on a sort of hopeful note, because while we have seen this really well-organized, coordinated, and funded attack on gender rights across Europe and the US, that obviously culminated in the overruling of Roe v. Wade in 2022, which meant that states were allowed to ban abortion in their own individual states rather than abortion being a protected federal right. We have also seen the response and the energy and the determination of pro-gender, pro-LGBT, pro-abortion movements in response to this. So, for example, in Argentina, they've decriminalized abortion not long in December 2021. In Ireland in 2018, the Together for Yes campaign led to the decriminalization of abortion in that country. We're seeing state after state in Mexico decriminalizing abortion so that women have access to reproductive health care. And we've seen places like Colombia and Chile make moves towards decriminalizing abortion so that women can access their full human rights in those countries. So when Roe was overruled in June 2022, I spoke to someone from the Center for Reproductive Rights, and they said the thing we have to remember is that since 1973, when the US made abortion legal, 53 countries have improved access to abortion, and only 4 have decreased or made abortion harder to access. So the momentum is with the side that believes in women's human rights and women's reproductive rights. And while I think the sort of hard right turn of some of the Conservative Party in the UK is something we need to be aware of and fighting back against, there is real momentum to improve access to abortion in the UK and around the world. And one of the things I say in my book is, we are a movement too, and we can win. So does anyone have any questions?